Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the Day of Laughter, Enlightenment in Everyday Life. I'd like to begin this month's talk on a personal note. An extraordinary thing happened to me this week while I was thinking about this talk and what it means to be awake to our existence, conscious of mystery, and open to the ongoing revelations that life is always throwing our way, reminding us that we're not in control and that the story we tell ourselves about who we are, where we came from, and what we can expect of our future are really nothing more than that, stories. I was at home at the end of a long workday, talking to my sister on the telephone about family events and, various dramas. We have a very small family. It's just my sister and I and her 3 sons. Our mother passed away 20 years ago, and our father disappeared when I was 4, and my sister was an infant. For years, we used to wonder about our father. I had even written a book about looking for him. But we'd long since given up on actually finding him or learning what had become of him in the half-century since he disappeared. We'd closed the book on that story, the way all of us do in uncertain life when we run out of information and just get on with the business of adapting to our losses and remaking ourselves in their wake. My sister and I finished up our weekly phone call and hung up feeling, glad to have connected. A few minutes later, I turned on my computer to send an email, and I found one that I wasn't expecting. It was a polite note from a man whose name I didn't recognize. Let me just read you the first sentence to give you a gist. Dear Mark, I first tried to contact you in 2013 when I mailed a letter to a Miss Harris, but the letter was returned. That's my literary agent. My name is Jim, and I was born in Illinois in 1965. My father was also James Matousek. My mother knows we shared the same family because he told her about your family. Now, by this time, my stomach had dropped to my feet. The note went on. He gave her your correct names, but told her that you had all died in a car accident. I stopped reading to sort of take in this shocking bit of news. Then I finished the rest of the note, which said that my father had disappeared from this guy's life, too, and he wondered how I'd feel about welcoming a new half-brother into our family. Well, I reread the email several times, overcome by a torrent of mixed emotions, shock, excitement, anger, grief, and also this unsettling impression that the lid on my life, my reality, had just fallen off and revealed a major gap between what I thought was true and what wasn't, and in turn who I believed myself to be and this man who was my father and what had actually been the case. You see, in the 50 years since my father disappeared, I had constructed a myth about this man, that he was good but misunderstood, that he never came back because he was possibly dead or unable to. But now this myth was revealed to be a blatant fiction. I wrote back to this Jim Matousek, thanking him for telling me the truth, and I promised to be in touch very soon. The following day, I woke up with the strangest feeling. It was aftershock mixed with the remnants of outrage, and something else that's hard to find words for. It was a kind of floating emptiness, a spacious, almost buoyant sensation that reminded me of the title of Milan Kundera's novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. I felt as if I'd been somehow unshackled, like a weight had been cut off that I'd been dragging all these years without knowing it. I wasn't happy to know that my father was a liar, but the news of what had actually happened was enormously freeing as well. It opened up a space that was buried deep inside me, a kind of refuge place, of which I'd only ever been partly aware. As often happens in our human lives, the experience of unwelcome emotional pain, the kinds of things that we avoid at all costs, also prompted a paradoxical healing, the kind of liberation that comes when we tell the truth and find ourselves naked against the unknown. When I told my sister, she wept at first, until finally we found ourselves laughing together, just out of sheer awe and disbelief that this had happened. This reminded me of a strange account of a woman telling the great Saint Anandamoy Ma a terrible story about her life. After describing the painful episode, Anandamoy Ma began to laugh and laugh until the tears flowed down her face. The woman was shocked and asked her why she was laughing at her misery. Anandamoy Ma replied, "Because you are being shown the end of misery through the cracks that this misery is opening in your heart. Through them you can see the sun of the self shining." Now, before you judge the saint's response as cold or unnatural, inhumanly detached, let's look more closely at the eternal truth of what she was saying to this woman in grief. You are being shown the end of misery through the cracks that this misery is opening in your heart, Anandamoy Ma said. Through them you can see the sun of the self shining. In other words, while the troubles of our lives, the losses, griefs, and unbearable pains are, of course, nothing to laugh at in an ordinary sense, from the perspective of an enlightened master who's filled with compassion and wants nothing more than to help us get free, to remind us of what we really are, the shining self, the Buddha nature, anything that succeeds in cracking our story and waking us up, no matter how unsentimental and even harsh it may be, is a form of grace, pure and simple, even if it hurts. It's the grace that a surgeon uses when he takes up a scalpel and cuts away sickness. When a spiritual master, recognizing the cause of our suffering, takes up the sword of discrimination and wisdom in order to help us toward liberation, they don't coddle us with pretty stories or sentimental comfort. Instead, like the fierce Hindu goddess Kali, they wield the blade of wisdom without apology, cutting away at the prison bars of the mind. You're going to hear this same kind of ferocity in the work of Byron Katie, who's this month's Seekers Forum guest. Empathy is terrific, Katie told me once. But when a person is struggling to survive, pity is not their friend. It does more harm than good. If someone we care about is hurt, then I feel hurt because they're hurt. Oh, you poor thing, I'm so sorry for you. Now there are two of us hurt. What good am I? Not surprisingly, Katie has come under fire in some spiritual circles for this cruel to be kind approach. But I've seen it work wonders for people in emotional and spiritual distress. It's what Ram Dass calls fierce grace. After nearly dying of a massive cerebral hemorrhage, Ram Dass described this stroke that he had had as the samurai's sword, severing his attachment to who he'd been so that he could become who he really was. Whatever it takes to get the job done, even when it hurts, is fierce grace. Now, of course, this definition of grace runs counter to much of what we're taught about spiritual practice, especially in the New Age movement. As we were discussing last month in our work with the shadow and experiencing darkness, exploring our wounds, feeling our pain, being awakened by the pain of our attachments being taken away. This shadow work is critical to awakening in everyday life. Only a simplistic, sentimental version of spiritual practice avoids the darkness required for illumination. I've just finished the most fantastic book about how we're healed by entering the shadows. It's called Waking Up to the Dark, and it's by an ex-Zen monk named Clark Strand, and I highly recommend it to you. I'm going to put it in our resource library. Strand makes the point that in our obsession with light in our electrified age, we've lost the gifts of darkness, which include the ability to see the mystic light that requires no bulb or socket and can only be perceived in darkness, both literal and spiritual. In other words, it's by passing through this interior darkness that we realize the light is already on, that we are in fact already enlightened, and that the only things blocking us from this awareness are our obsessions with the light itself and the illusions that we carry about who we are. Once we see that it's only by confronting our obstacles to freedom, our darkness, that freedom can possibly be enjoyed, we learn, if not to welcome pain, at least to view it as a good sign that we're moving in the right direction. To the logical, self-protective ear of the ego, of course, this will sound like senseless masochism. But to the spiritual ear, it makes perfect sense, because the seeker's life is not one of self-protection, avoidance, and comforting myths that keep us in an ignorant trance. Instead, it's a life that's focused on telling the truth in order to live in reality as free and awakened people, shedding the things that hold us hostage. But first, we must recognize that we are held hostage, and that requires intention and courage. This is a very important point that can't be emphasized enough. Spiritual life requires us to step toward our own pain, not away from it, which requires a counterintuitive will and courage to change. When a meditator stays on the cushion in spite of the hell realms that his mind is plunged into, that is going toward the pain. When a lover stays put instead of fleeing the scene in the midst of a difficult moment, that is going toward the pain. When an artist stays in her studio facing down the demons of uncertainty and fear, that is going toward the pain. Everything that awakens us, in fact, calls on us sooner or later to go toward the pain in order to find what's on the other side. Love, art, activism, service, and all forms of genuine spiritual practice. None of these are possible without courage, the moment-to-moment choice to awaken, the willingness, the surrender, the intention to meet discomfort in the name of freedom, rather than choosing to remain comfy and doomed in a trance of denial. There's a reason why in parables and fairy tales, the treasure, the fleece, the grail, is guarded by fire or snakes or dragons. In the life of awakening, progress only happens by crossing through danger, the ego throwing up resistance and lies, protecting its survival by keeping us from knowledge of our true nature. Turning toward the pain in our lives in the name of healing, remembering, and freedom is our sacred opportunity at every moment. There's a wonderful passage in one of Martin Goodman's books that I love. He writes, "The knights of King Arthur's court adventure through forests and realms of great daring, their search for a golden chalice, also a search for the meaning of life. I see that these forests of darkness," he writes, "are truly within ourselves, that the demons and dangers we meet there are the shadows and shames of our life. We have made the quest for the Holy Grail into a story, and in so doing we have externalized it. But truly the journey we have to make is deep into our own being. The Holy Grail is not something that stands outside of ourselves," writes Martin Goodman. "That's why it's so elusive and why it seems so very well hidden." Isn't that beautiful? And this is how we live our lives, wandering around the world looking for the Holy Grail that's already within us. As many of you may already know, it's a lot easier to embark on that outer journey than it is to come home to ourselves and do the long, hard work of seeking within and uncovering the gifts that are hidden there. I did this myself for many years, wandered around like a Dharma bum, searching for answers, hoping to find the Holy Grail, till I finally realized that there was no escape from meeting myself and my ignorance, my obstacles and obscurations where I lived. This is difficult, solitary, long-term work, which is exactly why I created the Seekers Forum for folks like myself who are engaged in the inner journey and seeking the Grail within in the course of our everyday lives, looking for the openings to make the dive to wisdom. The good news is that life is constantly affording us opportunities, great and small, for making this internal dive toward wisdom. This experience with my new half-brother was certainly such an opening. For someone else, the opening might be an insight found in a book, or unexpected changes on the job, or fears about the state of the world. In the case of a friend of mine, this opening to wisdom came in the form of cancer. If you were to create a police lineup of people likely to get sick, my friend Lisa would be the last person you would choose. As a non-smoking, non-drinking triathlete, a competitor in the Ironman races, Lisa had led a charmed life as an editor-writer who resembled the love child of Jodie Foster and a Norse god. Despite her beauty and outward well-being, however, Lisa had always struggled with internal doubts and dissatisfaction, tormented relationships, and a dogged philosophical hunger that sent her seeking happiness out there somewhere, from silent retreats to desert monasteries, from Brazil to Sri Lanka. In spite of her seeking, though, Lisa remained unhappy. Not all the time, but underneath there was this mysterious, low-thrumming discontent that undermined her efforts to be free. I had always admired her diligence and hoped that Lisa would catch a break. Instead, one day she started to bleed and discovered that she had stage 3/4 uterine cancer. Lisa met this challenge like the jock that she is, tackling the treatment like a triathlete strategizing the shape of a track, through 2 surgeries, through radiation, and through a prolonged course of chemotherapy. Now, oddly enough, this secret unhappiness that had haunted her whole life seemed to decrease, not increase, in the face of her possible death. And when we met for coffee a couple of weeks ago, sitting across from her at the restaurant, the day after she finished chemo, I would hardly have known, honestly, aside from the headscarf and a few pounds lost, that she had been so terribly sick. In fact, Lisa seemed to be beaming. I told her that she looked fantastic, which was true, and Lisa just shrugged and sipped her tea. She said, "That's because I sewed my parachute." Lisa explained that all her years of seeking and practicing and struggling with her demons had been, she now realized, like sewing a parachute, stitching it up with blood, sweat, and tears, including the discipline of being an athlete and learning the lessons of pain and gain. When she got her diagnosis, she told me, Lisa discovered that she had this interior apparatus to call on to help her as she fell to earth. I was still freaked out, she was quick to tell me. I still had bad moments. It wasn't like I was in any denial, she said. When you have cancer, you don't really have that option. But I wasn't completely lost in the pain. I wasn't without tools or guidance. I wasn't alone without a thing to support me. I realized that I'd been sewing my parachute my whole life and preparing for a moment like this. And what it did was help me land near my center. The center that Lisa was referring to became her refuge, the place within, deep within, that she would never have been able to reach had her old story not been taken away. She wasn't being glib. She wasn't pretending to be heroic. She wasn't denying a bit of the struggle or the fears or the demons that cancer presented. She wasn't pretending to be stronger than she was or immune to the ups and downs of disease, not in the least. But the characteristic bravado was gone, the effort to cover over her darkness with a golden surface of athletic power, what she used to like to call her wasp veneer, that she'd used as a mask. Now, instead, Lisa looked tender and exposed, and this vulnerability revealed the treasure, the grail that she had been seeking by running away. I saw the light of this treasure reflected in her face. It was a mixture of awe and disbelief, bittersweet as well as transcendent. The moody, over-serious, self-questioning woman I'd always known and loved had become more light-hearted, humble, and funny than I had ever known her to be. Anyone who's been through cancer or any serious disease knows that along the way, you're bound to come through episodes of pure black humor. Just ridiculous things happen when you go into a hospital. And by the end of the lunch, Lisa had me in stitches talking about colostomy bags and other macabre humiliations. She said, "So many things I thought I could never do are nothing to me now." She said, "The worst has actually helped me get free." In the prospect of confronting her possible death, this Ironman triathlete had managed to drop nearly everything but the parachute she sewed with all those years of seeking. With its help, she was able to make the dive within. So, how can we remember who we are and what we're capable of, to see the light of the self shining through in the midst of our everyday lives? We ask ourselves, does it really require a tragedy? The answer is no, it doesn't. But it does require catastrophe. The word catastrophe comes from the Greek verb meaning to overturn. Remember, from the egotistical point of view, spiritual awakening is nothing short of catastrophe. It turns our values upside down. It challenges our cherished opinions. It removes us from the seat of ultimate power. It forces us to cede control to forces beyond us and to open our hearts and minds rather than defending against transformation. Until we overturn the lie of the mind that we're synonymous with our circumstances, that we're limited by the sums of our fears, that we're unworthy of God in awakening, that we're separate from all other beings, and that there's nothing that we can do to alter this situation, we cannot experience the cosmic laugh, the laugh of the full catastrophe, as Jon Kabat-Zinn calls it. Until we pass through the illusion of who we are, we can't experience the spiritual death that's necessary for spirit to fully awaken, a death that leads through certain darkness. Fortunately, as I've said, life is constantly giving us opportunities to die in this way, to the life of illusion, and to dive into the truth of our being. By taking these opportunities rather than avoiding them at all costs, we accelerate our own awakening and open the door to the light within us. Now, here are 5 useful things to remember on an everyday basis that will help you court this spiritual catastrophe that's necessary for awakening. The first is that the ego is always alone. When we realize that our loneliness, our alienation, fragmentation, disconnection, all those things that make us so unhappy and hide the light within from us are the direct result of the make-believe ego that in its effort to make us individuals also sets us apart from the rest of creation. We come in time to recognize the culprit posing as our best friend. The ego poses as our best friend, but is actually the thing that separates us from the rest of creation. When this happens, when we have this recognition of how the ego keeps us alone, a crack appears in the story that we tell about ourselves that allows the light of truth to shine through and guides us toward a more lasting happiness that is available to us at every moment. The second thing to remember is that we live lives of mistaken identity. We live lives of mistaken identity. Now, we're going to be talking about this much more next month in the imposter syndrome, but it needs to be mentioned here. When we realize that in the most fundamental way, we are not who we think we are, and that we are in fact impersonating fictional creatures that do not exist, this lonely I, and spend our lives constructing false premises and protecting reputations and wandering in the shadow of what isn't real, we do experience a kind of a pop, a kind of an upsurge of laughter at how misguided we've actually been. The third thing to remember is that just because it's real doesn't mean that it's true. Just because things are real doesn't mean that they're true. This is a major sticking point for a lot of us. If the ego isn't true, how can it cause so much suffering? If so much of what we see is illusion, how does it give us ulcers? The reason is that the feelings are real, even if they're based on untrue assumptions, like so much of what we experience in our lives. As human beings with active imaginations, so active that we can make false things true, we're uniquely capable of living in fictitious realities and feeling their effects in our hearts and minds. Just look at how stories and myths can move you. With our sensitive nerves and oversized hearts, we're able to care regardless of the fact that things are make-believe. This is our genius. It's our great gift of creativity, as well as being our curse. To assume that because we feel things, that the causes of those things are true, is as mistaken as believing that because we weep in the movie theater, that the film itself is actual life. The fourth thing to remember is that without courage, there is no awakening. Contrary to what we might like to believe, transformation comes at a cost. Waking up hurts us before it helps us, because it involves the loss of cherished stories. The choice to be brave, to open our hearts, dive into the darkness, and trust that there's light beyond, requires an ongoing act of courage that must not be underestimated or undervalued. It's hard to lose the cover of fiction and step into the light of truth, but it is also the only path worth taking. I learned this when the truth about my father appeared, a truth that I would have avoided my whole life, in spite of what my mother had told me. But now I had no choice. I had to find the courage to open and not slam shut, to release the lie that I had been holding on to. And when this happened, I realized that underneath my fear, underneath my grief, I was, in fact, already free. And the last thing to remember is that what is on the day of laughter is also now. That's what Ramana Maharshi, another great Indian saint, told a student when asked how to reach enlightenment. What is on the day of laughter is also now. In the enlightened mind, time doesn't exist, not in the linear sense that we mean it. The enlightened live in a state of perpetual now. For the awakened, there is only the present. And though it may take days and months and years to practice coming into the truth of ourselves, for the light of the self to shine through, still, this state is always happening now, and now, and now again. There's only ever the present in the enlightened mind. So, I'd like you to just ask yourself a few questions to determine where you're stuck and where perhaps your ego is creating loneliness in your life, where it's creating obstacles to awakening that you're not even aware of. Okay? How do you keep other people at a distance? How do you protect yourself from the cracks that show up in your life, the opportunities to dive into the truth and move toward the pain in order to heal it instead of running in the opposite direction? How in your life are you living a case of mistaken identity? Where do you feel like an imposter? What things are you struggling with in your life that are real but not true? Where are the illusory problems that you're struggling with that when you look at them straight on are not problems at all, or certainly not as serious as you believe them to be? Where in your life could you be more courageous than you are? This is so important. This isn't about blaming ourselves for being cowards. It's about rallying and understanding the power at our disposal when we have choice, intention, and courage. There is no awakening without courage. Transformation comes at a cost. Is this a cost that you're willing to pay? What would you have to lose in order to be free? What stories would you have to question or even sacrifice in order to step into the light of truth, in order to push aside the cover of fiction and be authentic and brave in your life? And finally, do you believe that you are already enlightened? Is that an idea that you have space for in your mind? Is that something that you actually consider to be possibly true? Or does it just seem impossible? And if so, why? If so, why? Why do you imagine that wisdom is so far away? And what about the Holy Grail? Is that something that you believe exists outside of you? Are you someone who spends your time seeking externally and missing opportunities to take the deep inner journey? This is very, very important because there's nowhere to go. It's wonderful to learn from other people. It's wonderful to visit holy sites. There are times for going on a retreat and doing those kinds of, specialized spiritual activities. But the other 99.9% of your life is lived in the present, in the here and now of your ordinary life. How can you create a practice of finding that refuge within yourself and learning to touch that grail that you're carrying at your core at every moment? Do you believe that it's there? Once you understand that the possibility exists that you are already enlightened and that the day of laughter is also, that's an enormous step toward actualizing this kind of wisdom and freedom in your own life.